This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Welcome, folks. Here we are one more time at Core Brain Journal. This is episode 047, and we have a very interesting guest today, an individual who has done some exceeding research on binge eating disorder. We're going to talk about binging and food and recovery. That's the main point. If we can understand it, we can perhaps wrap our arms around it and do something better with ourselves to recover from it. Dr. Glenn Livingston, thank you so much for coming on board with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Me too, so much. So Dr. Livingston is an author who's written a book called Never Binge Again, Permanently Overeating. And he has an ebook, and he's going to do an ebook giveaway. Let's pause before we even get started on this particular point because you're so generous with this. And I just wanted you to introduce the concept. You've done a number of these interviews before, but I want to just express on behalf of our audience appreciation for what you're about to do. So tell us what you're going to do for us.
Well, I'm going to walk you through my personal background and history and help you understand why I wrote this book, which, by the way, is called Never Binge Again, Stop Overeating and Binge Eating and Learn How to Think Like a Permanently Thin Person.
Oh, I like that. That's not what it said in the notes here. I apologize.
That's okay.
I love
That's
that
okay.
title.
It's kind of a long title, and you're not the only one who has a little trouble remembering it. It's my fault as a marketer for No, your title is so refreshing. I mean, it just didn't come up on the copy. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. So I'm going to kind of set the background and help you understand why this was important to me in particular, why I got obsessed with trying to solve the problem. It was kind of a matter of life and death for me. I'm going to walk you through some of the research that I did and some interesting things that I found, but then I'm going to bring you to a kind of surprising conclusion for what actually worked for me and the method that I teach to other people now, kind of very practical, step-by-step way of approaching it. And I'll tell you that up front, this is not for everyone. Some people get offended by some of the things I'll say. I don't think they're offensive, but some of the people do get offended. And I won't be offended if you're offended. And so just kind of listen with an open mind and understand it's a little controversial. And definitely, I prefer to make these presentations as just Glenn Livingston rather than Dr. Livingston, because not everything that I'm saying is necessarily in concert with the best practices of my license and my profession. So with that little tease, we can go whatever you want.
Oh, good. Thank you. So, yeah, I'm sorry I asked such a vague question because it followed our conversation about your ebook giveaway, and I just thought it was so generous. And what Glenn is going to do is going to make his ebook available for our listeners. All they have to do is opt in. We'll have the opt-in code down there. And he has, that book will take you further to some very interesting reader bonuses at his website. So just, don't hesitate to pop on that. I'm not going to save it for the end of the presentation because we're just going to start right there with it.
Okay.
And then we'll go ahead with, Dr. Glenn. I'm going to do an intro. Dr. Glenn Livingston is a psychologist, and he's been interviewed by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Daily News. He has researched the nature of overeating for decades and did a self-funded study with, get this, 40,000 plus participants on binge eating disorder. Today, Glenn shares his personal journey out of his own obesity and provides practical tips to stop overeating quickly. Is that interesting or what? I mean, this is going to be a great conversation. I'm looking forward to it. So before we actually begin, tell us a little bit where you are, your personal life, and then we'll get into the quote-unquote narrative, if you will.
Well, I'm basically fine now. I rarely make mistakes. I recover from them quickly. I'm 6'4", about 205 pounds, fairly muscular. I early on in my life, I had what you'd call exercise bulimia. I don't think we had a diagnosis for it back then. But it basically meant that because I was a big guy and I liked to work out, I discovered if I worked out really hard, I could eat whatever I wanted to. And I really enjoyed being a food processing machine. I like to work out, I like to eat, and it all worked out really well until I started to be a grown-up with responsibilities. And kind of as I was getting towards the second half of graduate school, which gets pretty intense, seeing patients. I was married by then. Had a lot of responsibilities, and I found it wasn't possible to make the time to work out as much as I wanted, but it was really hard to stop eating as much as I wanted, and I started gaining an awful lot of weight. My triglycerides rose to, I think, 1100 was about the highest. I've got an actual test copy that's around 800, so I know it was at least that high, but I seem to remember 1100. And I had about a dozen warnings from doctors that I was going to be dead by the time I was 30 if I kept doing this, because I had really bad genetics, and most of the men in my family have heart attacks, and my mom had a heart. So on and on and on, I really was kind of in trouble. But I found that there was an obsession that developed, and it was difficult to stop thinking about food even while I was seeing patients. I was a marital and couples therapist, and I wound up working also with a lot of very troubled young adolescents. And I did my best, and I was very successful. But the truth is that a lot of the time that I was working with the patients, I was thinking about, when can I go get a whole pizza? Or, when can I go to the delicatessen and dislodge my jaw and empty most of it into my stomach? So,
I like that in your notes. What a picture. Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, I had the obsession. Anybody that, there's a phenomenon. I think we can all agree there is a phenomenon of binge eating disorder, and there's kind of a continuum that it goes from. But most people have had the experience of overeating and having difficulty stopping, like eating beyond their best judgment. Oh my God, I'm so full, but what the hell? I can have another piece of cake, right? Some people have had the experience, it's almost like there was a gun to their head and they really can't stop. And some people eat until their gums bleed, and it can get that bad. I think that there are qualitative as well as quantitative differences between them, but almost everyone has some aspect of having difficulty controlling their food because of the society that we live in. We live in a world where, there are 5,000 to 7,000 messages advertised to our children about food, and virtually none of them are about vegetables, right? So from the time we're little, we're programmed to eat sugar and flour and starch and all these things that are hyper palatable, have a lot of calories in a small space, and didn't really exist as we were evolving. There were no chocolate bars on the savannah. There were no potato chips on the savannah. And so, on the one hand, we've got the billions of dollars of the food industries, big foods, research and advertising coming at us. On the other hand, we have these hyperpalatable industrialized foods, and then it's kind of also built into the fabric of society that we all indulge to a certain extent. So people are constantly making excuses for one another, and from the very beginning when we would break bread together, it's in some ways insulting to other people when you don't eat what they're eating. So it's a tremendously difficult problem. And so if you feel like you're sometimes unable to stop eating or stop thinking about food, it's not just because you've got this sickness inside. It really is a very complex cultural phenomenon. And hopefully I can tell you some ways to get around that. But I'll pause there in case you have any questions.
Well, no, I think you're raising some very interesting points. Well, I think the point that you were raising, which is so absolutely essential, is it's complex. It's multidimensional. I mean, you have the biologic. Once a person's onto sugar and straight carbs, there's a somatic contribution. And then there's the whole, which we'll talk about later on a little bit, is the whole executive function. And then there's what society thinks about the individual. And then there's the whole idea of anxiety that's untreated, and the whole biochemistry of untreated anxiety, which has to do with a deeper process of epigenetic change, which we cover in interviews with some of our other guests. I mean, it gets pretty deep. But I think the thing is really I'm looking forward to, Glenn, is you telling us how you came to it, and then what you started, and then how you evolved as a person, really experiencing it yourself, what you tried and didn't work, and what you tried that did work.
Okay. So, when I realized that I was in trouble, when I started to get the diagnosis, the blood work, and the doctors yelling at me that I was going to die soon, as a psychologist who'd grown up in a family of 17 therapists and psychologists and counselors and social workers, I naturally took a very psychological approach in trying to solve this for myself. And, I grew up in and around New York City. My father teaches at Postgraduate Center, and I had access to a lot of the most renowned doctors around. And I went to some of them, and, we really looked at childhood underpinnings, and I learned some really interesting things. Like, for example, when I was a boy in the early 60s, my father was a captain in the Army, and my mother was kind of overwhelmed with the thought of him going to Vietnam, and some trouble with her dad, and so the bottom line is that during my early feeding years, my mom wasn't completely available. She was kind of depressed and scared, and she used to keep a bottle of Bosco. Do you remember Bosco?
Oh yeah, I'm old enough for it. Absolutely.
I love that stuff.
I graduated in 1960, so from high school.
Oh, well, okay. Well, I can call you Dad then. She used to keep a bottle of Bosco in a refrigerator on the floor, and she would kind of push me towards it when I would be crying or need a hug, or, had other really important needs that needed to be satisfied. But I totally love my mom, and I can totally understand why she needed to do that. And honestly, back then we had no idea how bad that stuff was for you. But so, I have a very early pattern of associating chocolate with loneliness and isolation and feeling the need for love. And so it's intriguing that I had a particular problem with chocolate as I got older. But here's the thing. It didn't help to know that. I mean,
key point.
Yeah, it didn't help to know that. It was very soulful to know that. It made for very interesting discussions to know that. It led me to learn a lot of other things about me that shaped my character and helped me to forgive my parents and things like that. But it didn't help me with the food problem. And here's why. Because at the moment of impulse, we don't necessarily have access to the level of deep insight and grounded decision making that would require to really make use of that insight at that moment. At the moment of impulse, the lizard brain really wants to take over. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of biological factors that can make that stronger. So if you haven't gotten enough nutrition, then you're going to be biologically driven to be less discriminating in your food, and you're going to really look for a lot of calories in a small space in a great package. And so what would happen is that there's no matter how sane I was about my plans, like this one time with chocolate, I remember another Monday morning diet, I decided I was going to follow this diet that required me to eat a lot of vegetables. And as I'm standing near the Starbucks counter waiting to pay for my latte, there's this big hairy chocolate bar that's staring at me. And the closer I got, the better it looked. Until I literally heard this little voice inside my head that said, Glenn, where does chocolate come from? Chocolate comes from cocoa beans, and cocoa beans grow on a plant. So technically chocolate is a vegetable. And of course, chocolate's not a vegetable. Of course, I rationally knew that. But at that moment, in my frustration, having stood at the counter long enough, being that tempted, that little voice convinced me that just for a moment that it was okay because chocolate was a vegetable. And then I was off to the races, because once you have the chocolate, then chocolate doesn't really go well without a couple of muffins, and then you need another latte to wash it down. And, before you know it, you're going to diet next week instead of this week, and you're gone. And I discovered that when I tried to apply, these are the kind of things that I found in that 40,000 person study also. I found that people who craved chocolate tended to have difficulties with loneliness or be less satisfied with their love life. And people who craved starchy carbohydrates tended to be stressed at work, and people who crave salty, greasy potato chips and things, they tended to be very anxious. And I would find the same thing when I tried to work with patients, is that there would be this little voice inside of them that would say, well, okay, that makes sense that chocolate is associated with feeling lonely and unloved. So I guess then, until we solve our feelings of loneliness and figure out how mama didn't feed us the right way, that we're going to have to keep binging. And it was that little voice that really had to be dealt with more than why mommy and daddy didn't love us enough, and figuring out all of the in-depth psychology behind it. And it was difficult for me to get this. I mean, I really struggled until I was almost 40 years old, because I'm such a psychologist, because every bone of my body says there's a psychological reason for everything. And because there is a psychological reason, but it's a correlation, it's not the causation. And that led me to do more research into addiction and alternative writings and treatments for addiction. And I ran across a guy named Jack Trimpey at Rational Recovery. And he had developed a methodology which is very counter to the 12-step methodology. And he's very protective of his work, by the way, and he doesn't necessarily like psychologists because a lot of them bastardize it, so I'm really careful about what I say about him, except that I thought it was miraculous that when he's working with the black and white addictions, he found a way of really drawing a line in the sand and listening very carefully for that little voice inside of you. And he's got some techniques which give you just enough separation from that voice to get you those few extra microseconds in the moment of impulse where you can then jump back up into your right brain and have access to those cognitive decisions and remember all of your goals and aspirations and all the reasons that you wanted to make this other decision. Mm-hmm. And I had difficulty applying what he did to food, because food is a much more complex behavioral system. There are a lot more decisions we have to make all day long. There's a lot more controversy about exactly what a healthy diet is. I mean, I don't know if all the diet gurus agree on anything except that we should eat green vegetables. And so, I had to develop some techniques for really clearly defining a food plan without ambiguity. And people made more mistakes than they did. I think he did some Harvard study, and there's like a 66% success rate or something like that with alcoholism. But with food, people make a lot more mistakes, and so I had to be more forgiving in helping people recover from mistakes and in helping myself recover from mistakes. And what this all led up to was a kind of, you're going to think this is crazy, and I just want to warn people. I know what this sounds like as a sophisticated psychologist who's been on media and consulted, done millions of dollars of consulting for big companies, and the way that I think and everything that I've done. But this is what it was. I decided that I was going to come up with my own food plan. We can talk about how to do that later if you want to. And I was going to make it really clear so that if I heard a voice telling me to, for example, I might say that I'm never going to have chocolate again. And if I heard a voice that said I was going to have chocolate for any reason whatsoever, then I would determine that that voice was my inner pig, and it was just squealing. That was pig squeal, and it was squealing for its slop. And I would just say, well, chocolate is pig slop, and I never eat pig slop. And that was the end of the story. And it was like a lightning bolt for me. It was such a simplistic, non-psychologically intense, practical way of separating from that fat thinking self inside of me that, I had to learn more. And it was kind of like a seed that grew when I started to apply it to other things. And, there were a lot of learnings and mistakes along the way, but I developed a system and it worked really well for me and then for other people that I coached. And then I had to write a book.
It's so interesting because it sounds like really kind of an aversive guided imagery. And those imagery elements do have a certain authoritative power to them when they're really associated that way. I mean, it's I don't think there's anything crazy about that at all. I mean, I think that sounds like a very innovative way to actually put some practical internal boundaries on something that you were struggling with. You needed to find some way to deal with that impulse.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to have another doctor say that. It's a toxic analogy is really what it is. And I think the reason that it had such an impact is because it was a real paradigm shift. Up until that point, you could say I was trying to nurture my inner wounded child. And a lot of the binge eating recovery, overeating recovery programs, they're very much about nurturing your inner child and, being more psychologically at peace with yourself and in the world. But I think the problem is when it comes to a survival drive gone wrong, and I think that's what binge eating really is. I think that the survival drive is hijacked by industrial foods. When it comes to the survival drive gone wrong, if you give it an ounce of love, it just overruns you. And you almost have to define that entity as something that has no good intent whatsoever. It's something you have to feel disgusted by, just so that you can get those, so you can call on that feeling of disgust when you recognize it, and you can separate it from it enough to get those extra microseconds you need to make the right choice. So, yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I really thought about that. That's an interesting concept, toxic analogy. I mean, that's I really had thought about that before, but that is what it is. You're putting a big negative dash on that but in a concrete, harmful way. It's and it's a separation. Yeah.
And then the other elements of that to really affect that separation are once you have a goal. For example, I'll never have chocolate again. And by the way, there are a lot of people who really can eat chocolate all the time and be fine with it. So I have no judgments whatsoever about exactly what people eat. But I do encourage people to eliminate all the ambiguity from their plan. So they could make a definitive rule, like I'll never eat chocolate again. They could make a conditional rule, like I'll only ever have chocolate again at social events and no more than once per calendar month. Or they could just leave it alone and leave it unrestricted. Or they could have an always rule, like I'll always have 6 servings of fruit and vegetables and 8 glasses of water every single day. But the other piece of this that really affects the separation is to look at the positive side of it. So when I'm working with someone, let's say I decide that I'm never going to eat chocolate again. Well, why? What's my life going to be like in a year if I do that perfectly? If I don't have chocolate for a whole year, what's my life going to look like? And as soon as I consider that, I hear all this squealing inside saying, you can't do that and you're too weak, and what about Starbucks, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I just ignore that for the moment and I think about what's my life going to look like in a year, and I say, well, I'll be sleeping better because chocolate really interferes with my equilibrium and my neurotransmitters, and I frequently can't get more than a few hours of sleep in a day that I had chocolate. And so if I'm sleeping better, I'm probably going to get more done at work, and I'm going to be more well-rounded and confident, and might even have a financial impact on me. But I'm going to be a lot less obsessed with chocolate. I won't be thinking about it all the time, because I'd had periods before where I hadn't had it, and I know after a couple of weeks you just stop thinking about it, because there's no point in your pig craving something it's never going to have, so it stops thinking about it after a while. So I could let go of the obsession. I'd probably have more energy. I'd certainly be thinner. And I work with people to paint a very descriptive picture of everything that's going to change in their life in a year if they could comply with this new rule, not a guideline, but a rule, 100%. And then once you do that, you'll find that it starts to become a matter of character. It starts to become something about the person that you want to be. It's not just that you don't eat chocolate, but you want to be the kind of person who cannot eat chocolate.
Yes. Yeah, it's an evolutionary step for yourself. Yeah.
It really is. And it's extremely empowering, and people get very excited when they realize that they can do this, because it's like Sart said, we can remake ourselves. We really do have the power every moment that we get up and walk through the day to remake who we want to be. And up until that point, we actually felt like we were a slave to the impulse. We really felt like there was no choice. We couldn't live without this, chocolate or donut, or for some people it's even broccoli. Some people go overboard broccoli. I've learned a lot the more I do this. And so some people say, well, I don't really want to give that up. But what they don't realize is that there's so much freedom if they accept a certain amount of discipline. Like a jazz pianist can't really soulfully improvise unless they accept that there are certain skills that they have to follow to a certain extent. So it's all about affecting that separation. There are a couple of other elements that I discovered that are really important, particularly when you're dealing with food. And I can talk about that if you want to. We can talk about something else.
No, I think we're going down a path here that's helpful. And just to throw a little bit of my 2 cents worth in, we've seen people, you're talking about chocolate, which in a way is kind of so understandable, because a lot of people are in conflict about chocolate and whether you do it or whether you don't and how much you do. And we see people, however, because we do a lot of food testing in our offices, because we see individuals who wind up having certain food sensitivities that absolutely, just as you said a moment ago, directly affect brain function. Mm-hmm. Food affects brain function, no question about it. And it can help it can affect brain function in a positive way. But if you have an immunity sensitivity to it, it affects it in a negative way almost all the time. I mean, over 90% of the time. We get the results in. We do immunoglobulin G testing. And one of the things, while you're talking, I'm listening to you thinking about a patient who I had to tell her she was off the chart on milk and milk products, on every single milk product. I mean, it was redlined all the way over. And I said, look, this is great. You got some information here. You'll be able to really change your life, because the reason you've been refractory to psychiatric treatment, the reason it hasn't worked, is because you have all these, I didn't say this to her, but I'm saying it to you, cytokines standing in the way of your neurotransmitter receptors, and your receptors aren't working right. Your neurotransmitters are there, but they can't function on a molasses receptor. And she just completely freaked out on milk, right on the spot. I mean, she started crying. She said, I can't believe you're telling me this. I mean, it was kill the messenger time. And she was mad at me for months. Now, one would say, well, she was obviously addicted to milk. I mean, who knows what it was doing? There are certain opiate receptors that casein does affect. And I think then you're getting into a deeper level of, what the pharmacology and the molecular physiology is. But the bottom line is, this is a commonplace one that everyone takes for granted. But for her, it was an illness, and she had a very significant emotional reaction. And I wish I had the tool that you're talking about. I wish I had the concept of a way to really help her get over it, because I didn't have it until we're actually talking about it. It's very interesting.
Oh, cool. Well, okay, so here's some other elements that are important to think about, and there's some places where people get tripped up. The biggest one is probably that people are very frightened to make definitive rules. The traditional advice with overeating is to follow guidelines, and people will say, well, I'll follow at 90% and, I'll just do the best that I can. And that works in some situations and for some people, but there's a problem with it. And the problem is that on some level, when you say with a pleasurable substance that you're just going to do the best that you can, really what you're saying is that you're going to try for a while until you don't feel like it anymore. Mm-hmm. And that conflicts with the way we coach people to accomplish other goals in our society. So if you look at some of the psychology of sports winners, what we do with them is we tell them, if you want to climb that mountain and get to the top, what you need to do is visualize yourself on top with your arms in a big V for being victorious and having gotten there and being really happy and calm. And as you're climbing, don't let anything distract you from that vision. So any sense of doubt or uncertainty, that's just going to drain your energy for focusing on the goal. And the more you can visualize yourself up there, the more likely it is you're going to get there. And that's really what the winners do. But for some reason, when it comes to food, we tell people just do the best that they can. Mm-hmm. And so the reason that people are frightened of saying, I'll never have chocolate again, or I will only ever have chocolate again on social occasions, is because they're scared they're going to beat themselves up when they make a mistake, if they make an inevitable mistake. And it's kind of a paradox, but you need to hold aside a little part of you that knows that if you make a mistake, there's a different mindset that's required to recover from that mistake than the mindset that's required to set out towards the goal in the first place. It's not really helpful, particularly with food, to beat yourself up. It is helpful to experience the initial pain. Just like if you touch a stove that's too hot and you feel a little burned, you wouldn't want to eliminate that painful experience, because then you would go back to touching the stove again. But usually if people touch the stove, they don't obsess forever about what a weak person they are, and they're obviously not capable of avoiding touching the stove again, so they're just going to try the best they can, and inevitably they're going to put their hand on a hot stove a couple more times. That's often a single event learning experience, and they don't get overly involved with the guilt in that learning. And that's the same thing you need to do with food. If you make a mistake, even though you were perfectly committed and you said you would never do it again, well, so you made a mistake and you were human, and humans are fallible, and it's a serious thing, so you take the time to analyze what went wrong, and maybe you didn't have enough to eat before, or maybe you didn't plan for a particular trigger situation, but then you just get back onto that trail and head straight towards the top again. And so one way of conceptualizing this is that it's possible to be perfectly committed without being perfect. And it's a bit of a paradox, but once people get that and they keep getting up until they actually hit the goal, then the incidence of hitting the goal is much higher in my experience than if people say, well, I'm just going to do the best I can 90% of the time. It's a different mindset that I encourage people to take, but it's different and it's kind of controversial, and I take a lot of heat for it.
Well, you do. That's interesting because, it sounds so much, I worked in addiction medicine for many years. We used to call my practice in town here the Center for Personal Recovery.
Oh.
And we had very much the same intuitive approach that you have, because I was so upset. We live in a relatively small town, but having been doing presentations on addiction medicine around the country, the addiction community gets pretty fundamentalistic and reductionistic about this. And the business of abuse of individuals who relapse, instead of looking at it as a lesson So what happens is there's kind of there is an absolute reductionistic way of looking at it from the point of view you can't do this. It's just not going to be successful for you. And here's the positive that you can get out of it if you remain on the path. But I think you're exactly right. It's a different way to approach it if you lose it for a minute. How do you actually reconstruct yourself? And one of the things we always did, which is what sounds like what's going on with you, is what's the lesson when you're off the path? What can you take out of that experience to take you back on the path?
So let's talk about that just a little more, because there's some typical things that people's inner pigs say when they've fallen off the path. So if you make a rule for yourself and then you break it, your pig is going to immediately say, you cheated. This silly never binge again thing doesn't mean anything. And, you're obviously totally incapable. So I get to go on a big fat food orgy. Yippee, let's go do that. Right? Your pig will try to wear you down. It'll attack your character. It'll tell you this is never going to work. You should just give up and try something else. And the interesting thing, and this usually helps people get back on in my experience, is that if you think about it, the people who accomplish big goals almost never accomplish them in one try. The people who accomplish really big goals usually had to try things over and over and over again and have a certain amount of resilience and persistence until they got there. So when the pig is saying you've tried this so many times before in the past, it's actually complimenting you, but it thinks that it's putting you down and making you weak so it can binge more. So I find that insight is very helpful to people when they realize that their repeated previous efforts are actually a strength and not a weakness, and that encourages them to get back up and do it again.
I like the way you said it. That's exactly I couldn't agree with you more. Others may disagree. It sounds a little bit unconventional, but the whole practice of hammering individuals that have problems, it just never has made any sense to me whatsoever. And and if the inner pig is hammering the individual, then everybody's aligning to have a totally negative experience from something that could be potentially constructive if it's used correctly and effectively.
Carol Munter taught me that it's almost impossible to keep binging if you're not yelling at yourself. There's this self-castigation that goes along with obsessive overeating. And if you break the cycle of that, it becomes more difficult to keep going. A lot more difficult.
Very interesting. Whew. That's amazing. Yeah. That's true, because that's part of it. It's part of the whole pattern. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, listen, I want to, we're a little bit past time. I was so interested in the narrative that you have of how you got there, what you experienced, and how you came to these conclusions. It's been really interesting, Glenn. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Glenn Livingston, for coming on board with us here. And thank you so much for sharing your work, your book. What's your website? Let's tell us where you'd like to drive our crowd over to learn more about you and what you're doing.
Everything's at Never Binge Again. The reader bonuses, links to the book, everything is at neverbingeagain.com. You can get in contact with me there directly if you need to. Just Never Binge Again, neverbingeagain.com.
That'll be easy. We'll put that up on the show notes. Really appreciate it. It's been very interesting. I could see a number of applications. We see this all day, every day, and I know a number of our listeners do, and I think you really helped out a lot with the struggles that many of us have. Where do we go forward with something that looks like it's out of control? How can we actually evolve personally? Thank you so much, Glenn. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
We'll do it again sometime. Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make it.